Stand at the Brandenburg Gate today, and you are standing in a place that has been, within a single human lifetime, the capital of a democracy, the capital of a dictatorship, a field of rubble, the front line of a Cold War, and the stage where that war ended. For 28 years, the ground under your feet was a death strip. Crossing it could cost you your life. For at least 140 people, it did. This is the story of a town that began on a swamp in 1237, became the laboratory of the modern world, tore itself apart, was cut in half by its conquerors, and somehow ended up as the soul of Europe. Most cities hide their scars. Berlin builds monuments to them. The sand is waiting. Let's go down to the swamp where it all began. Chapter 1. The Swamp Towns. Every great city has a reason to exist. Paris had an island commanding a river crossing. Rome had 7 defensible hills. New York had one of the finest natural harbors on earth. Berlin had a swamp. Understand this one fact, and you will understand something about this city that will follow us through the next 8 centuries. Berlin was never supposed to be here. There is no natural harbor here, no mountain fortress, no crossroads of ancient empires. There is only a wide, flat valley filled with sand and water, carved out by melting glaciers at the end of the last ice age. Geologists call it an ancient meltwater valley. The people who lived here called it what it was: wet ground. Even the name seems to admit it. For centuries, people assumed Berlin was named after the bear, the animal that still stands proudly on the city's coat of arms. It is a good story. It is probably not the true one. Many language historians connect the name instead to an old Slavic root word, Berla, meaning swamp or marsh. If they are right, then Berlin, the great capital of Germany, means something close to the place in the wet ground. The bear came later, a piece of medieval branding by people who preferred a proud animal to a puddle. Remember that. This is a city that has been rewriting its own story from the very beginning. So who actually lived in this wet ground first? Long before any German speaker arrived, this valley belonged to Slavic peoples. From roughly the 7th century onward, Slavic tribes farmed and fished across this region, and they left their mark everywhere. The names of many of Berlin's modern districts still carry their words. Even the river that runs through the heart of the city, the Spree, flows out of that Slavic past. Then, in the 12th century, German lords pushed east across the Elbe River in a long campaign of conquest and settlement. And the man who took this particular stretch of land carried a name that sounds like it was invented for this story. Albert the Bear, his dynasty, the Ascanians, became the first rulers of a frontier territory called the Margraviate of Brandenburg. Berlin would grow up inside it, a border town, in a conquered land, from day one. Now, why would anyone build a town in the middle of a marsh? Look at the water. The Spree wanders through the valley, and at one point it splits around a low sandy island before narrowing between firmer banks. Just like the island in the Seine where Paris began, this was a place where the river could actually be crossed. Medieval merchants moving between the trading towns of the west and the Baltic ports of the east needed to get their wagons over the Spree somewhere. This was the somewhere. In time, the crossing was fixed with a dam and water mills, a structure Berliners called the Mühlendamm, the mill dam. Control the crossing, and you collect the tolls, control the mills, and you grind everyone's grain. It was not glamorous. It was profitable. And here is the detail most people miss. Berlin did not begin as one town. It began as 2. On the sandy island and the western bank stood a settlement called Cologne. On the eastern bank, facing it across the water, stood Berlin. 2 separate towns, 2 town halls, 2 councils, 2 parish churches, glaring at each other across one river, crossing and splitting the business between them. The oldest surviving document that mentions either of them is a church record from the year 1237, naming a priest from Chelm. And that is why 1237 is celebrated as the city's official birthday. Berlin itself first appears in the written records 7 years later, in 1244. But the paper trail is not the whole story. In the 2000s, archaeologists digging in the oldest quarter of the city uncovered oak timbers preserved in the wet ground, and tree ring dating suggested that some of that wood had been cut decades before 1237. The swamp, it turns out, is an excellent archive. It swallows things, and it keeps them. People were almost certainly living and building here well before the first clerk wrote the town's name on parchment. The official birthday is simply the moment the paperwork caught up with reality, which is, when you think about it, a very Berlin way to be born. Life in the twin towns was hard, wet, and busy. The people drove wooden piles into the mud to hold up their houses, exactly as the founders of Hiroshima would do on their river delta 3 centuries later, exactly as the builders of Venice and Amsterdam did in their own soaked ground. Berlin belongs to that strange family of cities that essentially float on timber and stubbornness. The towns traded rye from the surrounding countryside. Timber floated down the river, and fish pulled out of it. By the middle of the 1300s, Berlin and Cologne had grown confident enough to join the Hanseatic League, the powerful alliance of northern trading cities whose commerce stretched from London to Novgorod. For a pair of swamp towns, that was a seat at a very serious table. The 2 towns soon realized that everything that threatened one of them threatened both. They formed a formal union to manage defense and shared business, while jealously keeping their separate councils. It was less a marriage than a business partnership between neighbors who did not entirely trust each other. Hold on to that image. 2 halves of one city, joined at the water, never quite unified. It will not be the last time Berlin is a double city divided by a line down its middle. Then, as the 1300s wore on, the frontier luck ran out. The dynasty of Albert the Bear died out, and Brandenburg fell into decades of neglect under distant rulers who treated it as a source of cash and nothing more. Plague swept through. The same Black Death that emptied towns across Europe. Fire tore through the wooden streets, and a devastating blaze in 1380 destroyed much of Berlin, burning its records and much of its early history to ash. And with no strong ruler watching, the countryside slid into lawlessness. Noble families turned robber baron, riding out from their castles to plunder merchant convoys on the very roads that were the town's lifeblood. The chronicles of the period are full of their raids. For the merchants of Berlin and Chelm, the world had become a place where you could build, trade, and save for a lifetime, and lose it all in one afternoon on the road. The towns fought back as best they could. They hired soldiers, strengthened their walls, made alliances with other cities. But everyone understood the real problem. Brandenburg had no master. Somebody, eventually, would come to claim it. In 1411, somebody did. A prince from southern Germany was appointed to restore order in Brandenburg, and he restored it with a new weapon, the heavy cannon that cracked the robber barons' castles open like eggs. In 1415 he was formally granted the territory as its elector. His family's name was Hohenzollern. The merchants of Berlin and Chelm watched him bring peace to their roads, and they were grateful. They had no idea what they had just invited in. This family would rule Berlin for the next 500 years. It would drag the swamp towns to heights no one on the Mühlen Dam could have imagined, and into catastrophes no one could have survived unchanged. And the very first thing the citizens of Berlin would learn about their new masters is that the Hohenzollerns did not ask permission. The lesson would arrive with soldiers, in the town hall itself. That is where our next chapter begins. Chapter 2. The Unwilling City. The new master of Brandenburg was called Frederick, the second of his name in the Hohenzollern line, and history remembers him by a nickname that tells you everything: Iron Tooth. In 1440, Iron Tooth looked at the twin towns on the Spree and saw exactly what they were: rich, independent, and inconveniently proud. Berlin and Cologne ran their own courts, elected their own councils, and answered to the elector only when it suited them. They were, in their own minds, free trading cities in the tradition of the Hanseatic League. In the mind of Frederick Irontooth, they were his property, and it was time they learned it. His method was brilliant and brutal in equal measure. In 1442, he used a quarrel between the two town councils as his opening. He arrived as a mediator and left as an owner. He dissolved the union between Berlin and Cologne, stripped away key privileges, and claimed a piece of land on the island of Cologne itself, right at the heart of the twin towns. There he began to build a fortified palace, not outside the walls, where a protector would build, inside them, where a jailer would. The citizens understood perfectly. A castle inside your own city is not there to defend you. It is there to watch you. So in 1448, the people of Berlin and Selm did something astonishing. They rebelled against the most powerful man in Brandenburg. The chronicles of the period record that citizens stormed the records office, seized the documents in which their old rights were written, and drove out the elector's officials. And then they turned to their oldest ally, the one that had made the city possible in the first place: the water. They broke open the dams and sluices and flooded the foundation pit of the rising palace, drowning Irontooth's construction site in the waters of the Spree. The revolt is remembered in German as the Berliner Unwill, the Berlin indignation, the unwillingness of Berlin. It lasted less than a year. The towns looked for allies and found none, because the other cities of Brandenburg had already been broken or bought. Irontooth returned with overwhelming force, and Berlin capitulated without a hopeless siege. The punishment was not a massacre. It was something colder. The towns lost their independent courts, their free councils, and their seat at the Hanseatic table. The palace rose on the island after all, and for roughly the next 500 years, through electors, kings, emperors, and dictators, the rulers of this land would govern from that same spot at the centre of Berlin. Hold on to the image of that flooded foundation pit, because it captures the whole relationship between this city and its rulers in a single picture. Berlin would be governed, for most of its history, by masters it did not choose and often did not want. It would obey. It would build. It would even glitter on command. But somewhere under the obedience, the unwill never entirely drained away. Nearly 5 centuries after Irontooth, when a dictator ruled from the centre of Berlin, this would be the big city that gave his party some of its weakest election results in Germany. The unwillingness of Berlin is one of the oldest traditions the city has. For the next century and a half, Berlin settled into its new role as a residence town, living in the shadow of the palace. It was not a bad life. The court brought money, craftsmen, and a little glamour to the swamp. In 1539, Brandenburg followed much of northern Germany into the Lutheran Reformation, and Berlin changed its faith with, it must be said, no great drama. The city grew slowly, reaching perhaps 12,000 people by the end of the 1500s. A middling German town, provincial, Protestant, and peaceful. Then came the war that nearly erased it. In 1618, a revolt in Prague ignited the conflict that would consume Central Europe for a generation. The 30 Years' War began as a struggle between Protestant and Catholic princes and decayed into something with no clean name at all. A rolling catastrophe of armies that fed themselves by devouring the lands they marched through. Brandenburg, flat, open, and weak, lay directly in their path. Its ruler at the time tried to keep his territory neutral and discovered the fatal rule of that war. Neutrality without an army is not a policy. It is an invitation. The armies came again and again. Imperial troops and Swedish troops in turn occupied Berlin, extorted enormous payments, and stripped the surrounding country bare. With the soldiers came the older enemies, plague and hunger, which killed far more people than any battle. The records from these years are thin, which is itself a kind of evidence. But historians estimate that Berlin and Cologne together lost roughly half their population over the course of the war. A town of perhaps 12,000 became a town of 6,000 or 7,000, ringed by villages that had simply ceased to exist. Travellers in the worst-hit parts of Brandenburg wrote of riding for a day without seeing a living person. This was the first great death of Berlin. It would not be the last. And notice what did the killing. Not one dramatic day, but decades of occupation, extortion, disease, and abandonment by rulers who could not protect their own capital. In 1640, in the middle of this ruin, a 20-year-old inherited the throne of Brandenburg. His name was Frederick William, and he had spent part of his youth in the Dutch Republic, the most modern, most commercial, most cleverly engineered country in Europe. He came home to a wrecked, half-empty capital in a starving land, and he brought with him one conviction that would change everything. Never again would Brandenburg be a battlefield for other people's armies. Whatever it cost, this sandbox of a country would make itself strong. History would call him the Great Elector, and his most powerful weapon would turn out to be something no one expected: an open door. Chapter 3. The City of Refugees. Here is a question worth sitting with. How do you rebuild a city that has lost half its people, in a poor country, on bad soil, with no natural riches at all? The Great Elector's answer was radical for his century. You do not rebuild it with the people you have. You rebuild it with the people other rulers throw away. First, though, came the hard tools. Frederick William built what his father had fatally lacked: a permanent professional army, paid for by new taxes that he pushed through over the objections of his nobles and his towns. The lesson of the Berliner Unwilling held. Berlin objected, and Berlin paid anyway. He also reached back to the city's oldest logic: the water. In the 1660s, his engineers completed a canal linking the Spree toward the Oder River, which meant that trade moving between the North Sea and Eastern Europe could now conveniently pass through Berlin. The swamp town made itself, once again, a crossing point, this time for half a continent. But the masterstroke came in 1685, and it began, as so much in Berlin's story does, with a disaster somewhere else. That year, King Louis XIV of France revoked the legal protections of his Protestant subject, the Huguenots. Overnight, Hundreds of thousands of French Protestants faced a choice between forced conversion and flight, and they were, this is the point, exactly the people a ruined country needed: weavers, watchmakers, jewelers, bankers, officers, printers, pharmacists. France's most skilled minority was suddenly homeless. Within weeks, the Great Elector issued the Edict of Potsdam. It was, in modern terms, a targeted immigration program dressed in the language of religious charity. Huguenot refugees were offered free passage, building materials, years of tax exemption, and the right to worship in French. Historians estimate that around 20,000 Huguenots came to Brandenburg, and that by around 1700, roughly 1 Berliner in 5 spoke French as a mother tongue. Walk through central Berlin today, and you will still find the French cathedral standing on one of its finest squares, built for the children and grandchildren of those refugees. And the door did not open only to the French. In 1671, Frederick William admitted a group of Jewish families expelled from Vienna, allowing them to settle and trade in Berlin. Their community would grow into one of the great engines of the city's culture and science, and its fate, 2.5 centuries later, will be one of the darkest threads in this entire story. Bohemian Protestants came too, and Dutch engineers who knew how to drain wet ground, and settlers from across the German lands. All of them came, because Berlin had discovered its one inexhaustible natural resource. It had room for people nobody else wanted. Let this sink in, because it is the heart of this chapter, and honestly, one of the keys to this whole story. Berlin was not made great by its kings. Whatever the statues say, it was made great by refugees, over and over, in wave after wave, from the Huguenots of the 1680s to the displaced and the dissidents of much later centuries. The palace gave the orders. The newcomers built the city. Keep that in mind every time this story seems to be about one powerful man, including the powerful men we are about to meet. The Great Elector died in 1688, and his son Frederick had none of his father's iron and all of his vanity. History has been unkind to him, perhaps a little unfairly, because his vanity turned out to be historically productive. He wanted, more than anything, a crown in 1701. Through hard diplomacy and harder payments, he got one, crowning himself Frederick I. King in Prussia. The swamp town on the Spree was now a royal capital, and it needed to look like one. Under Frederick and his builders, Berlin acquired grand avenues, a great arsenal, palaces, and academies of arts and sciences, with the philosopher Leibniz as the Science Academy's first president. In 1709, the paperwork once again caught up with reality. Berlin, Köln, and 3 newer suburbs were merged into a single royal city called Berlin. Population, roughly 55,000, nearly 10 times what the 30 Years' War had left behind. Then, in 1713, the crown passed to a king who looked at all this glitter with open disgust. Frederick William I is remembered as the Soldier King, and he is one of the strangest figures in European history. He fired most of the court, slashed spending on art and ceremony, and poured every saved coin into one obsession: the army. Under his rule, Prussia, a middling state, built one of the largest and best drilled armies in Europe, and Berlin became, in large part, a garrison town. Soldiers were quartered in citizens' homes, whole new districts filled with military families. The king had a famous personal mania for exceptionally tall soldiers, recruited and sometimes effectively bought from across Europe for his regiment of giants at Potsdam. Foreign courts joked about the Sergeant King and his toy giants. The joke would age badly. Yet this same rough king made Berlin more modern in ways the elegant one never had. He ordered compulsory schooling in Prussia decades before most of Europe considered such a thing. He built the plain, practical housing that pushed the city outward. He was frugal, brutal, obsessive, and effective, and he despised almost everything his own eldest son loved, because the crown prince, another Frederick, loved poetry, he loved philosophy, played the flute seriously, wrote in French, and corresponded with the great minds of the Enlightenment. His father beat him for it and humiliated him publicly. And when the 18-year-old prince tried to flee the kingdom with his closest friend, the king had them both court-martialed. The friend was executed. Accounts from the time report that the prince was forced to watch. In 1740, the soldier king died, and this wounded, brilliant, ice-cold young man inherited the best army in Europe and a full treasury. Europe relaxed. A philosopher king. They said, a gentle age was coming. Europe was wrong. Within 7 months, the philosopher marched his father's army into a neighbour's territory without warning, and the swamp town on the Spree began its rise toward the centre of world history. That is our next chapter. Chapter 4. Frederick's Stage. The new king was 28 years old, and Europe thought it knew him. Frederick II of Prussia, the flute-playing prince, the friend of philosophers, the young man who had written an entire book attacking the cynical politics of Machiavelli. The gentle age was expected to begin at once. It lasted 7 months. In December of 1740, Frederick marched his father's perfect army, unused for a generation, into the Austrian province of Silesia, a rich land of farms and cloth towns to which his legal claim was, to put it politely, thin. He had calculated that Austria's new ruler, a young woman named Maria Theresa, would be too weak to respond. He was wrong about her character, and the two of them would spend the next 23 years, on and off, at war. But he was right about the army. Prussia took Silesia and held it, and the middling kingdom of sand suddenly ranked among the powers of Europe. Understand what this meant for Berlin. A capital is a stage, and Frederick, whatever else he was a master of staging. Along the great avenue of Unter den Linden, he built what he called his Forum, an opera house open to the paying public, a royal library, and a Catholic cathedral in a deeply Protestant city, which was itself a statement. And it is worth pausing on that statement. Frederick personally believed in very little, but he made religious tolerance official policy, writing in a famous marginal note, preserved in the Prussian state archives, that in his kingdom every man must get to heaven in his own fashion. In the Europe of his day, that sentence was close to revolutionary. The philosophers noticed. In 1750, Frederick achieved his greatest cultural conquest and lured Voltaire himself, the most famous writer alive, to live at his palace of Sanssouci near Berlin. Europe's most celebrated king and Europe's most celebrated mind, dining together nightly, in French, trading epigrams. It was a publicity triumph. It was also, within 3 years, a spectacular falling out between two enormous egos, ending with Voltaire effectively fleeing the kingdom and being briefly detained on Frederick's orders on his way out. Enlightenment Berlin was real, but it was enlightenment on the king's terms. The pattern of Iron Tooth held even in the age of reason. Brilliance was welcome, Independence was not, and the philosopher king's wars nearly destroyed everything. In 1756, facing a gathering alliance of Austria, France, and Russia, Frederick struck first, and the 7 Years' War began, a war whose colonial theatres pulled in America and India, which is why American readers may know its overseas half as the French and Indian War. Twice, enemy armies reached Berlin itself, and in 1760, Austrian and Russian troops occupied the city for several days, extracting a crushing ransom. Frederick lost battles, lost armies, and by the winter of 1761 was writing letters that contemplated his own death as the only exit. What saved him was pure chance. In January of 1762, the Russian Empress died, and her successor, a passionate admirer of Frederick, simply left the war. Prussians called it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Remember that phrase. In a bunker beneath Berlin, in April of 1945, a very different ruler would be waiting for that miracle to repeat itself. Frederick spent his last decades rebuilding his exhausted land, and Berlin with it. He drained marshes, welcomed yet more settlers, and pushed the potato onto Prussian farms with such persistence that visitors to his grave at Potsdam still, to this day, leave potatoes on the stone. When he died in 1786, alone with his dogs, Berlin held roughly 150,000 people and a reputation as one of the intellectual capitals of Europe. In its salon, including celebrated ones hosted by Jewish women of letters, the German Enlightenment argued itself into existence. The philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, who had entered Berlin as a poor 14-year-old through the gate reserved for Jews and cattle, became one of the most respected thinkers in Germany. The city of refugees was becoming a city of ideas. Frederick's successors were smaller men, and they seemed to have known it. So they did what smaller men do. They built bigger monuments between 1788 and 1791 at the western entrance to Unter den Linden. The architect Karl Gotthard Langhans raised a monumental sandstone gateway modelled on the entrance to the Acropolis of Athens, the Brandenburg Gate. In 1793 it received its crown, a copper sculpture by Johann Gottfried, shadow of a winged goddess driving a chariot drawn by 4 horses, the quadriga. She was meant to represent peace, riding into the city. Keep your eyes on her. Of everything in this story, she is about to have one of the strangest biographies in Europe, because while Berlin built monuments to peace, France had exploded. Revolution in 1789, a king guillotined in 1793, and out of the chaos a general with a genius for war and a hunger with no bottom. By 1806, Napoleon had crushed Austria and Russia and stood master of the continent. Prussia, which had spent a decade hiding in neutrality, chose that moment, the worst possible moment, to fight him alone. The old army of Frederick the Great marched out in October of 1806, still fighting in its grandfather's style. At the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, it was not merely defeated, it was annihilated in a single day. Fortresses that could have held for months surrendered to cavalry patrols. The king fled east, and on October 27th, 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte rode through the Brandenburg Gate at the head of his Grande Armée, into the capital of the state that had humiliated France for half a century. He looked up at Shadow's goddess of peace. Then he ordered her taken down, packed into crates, and shipped to Paris as a trophy. The gate stood bare. The proud kingdom of Frederick was, in the space of one autumn, a beaten satellite paying tribute to a conqueror. And yet, in the ashes of this humiliation, Berlin was about to be reborn in a way no palace decree had ever managed. The next chapter belongs not to kings, but to professors, engineers, and men on barricades. Chapter 5. Iron, Steam and Barricades. National catastrophe is a brutal teacher, but Prussia, to its credit, decided to learn. In the years after 1806, with French troops garrisoned in the country and half its territory stripped away, a circle of reformers around the ministers Stein and Hardenberg did something defeated states rarely do. They admitted the system itself had failed. Serfdom was abolished. Cities, Berlin among them, received self-government for the first time since Iron Tooth. And in 1809, Berliners elected a city council again after 3.5 centuries. Jewish Prussians were granted citizenship in 1812, incomplete and grudging, but real. The army was rebuilt around merit rather than noble birth. And in 1810, in a former palace on Unter den Linden, Wilhelm von Humboldt founded a new university on a radical idea: that teaching and research belong together, that a university exists not to drill students but to create knowledge. That model, the research university, was copied across the world, and it is fair to say that the modern American research university, from Johns Hopkins onward, is a descendant of that building in Berlin. Over the following century its halls would hold Hegel, the brothers Grimm, and eventually a young physicist named Albert Einstein. Prussia had lost an army and gained a brain. The revenge, when it came, was swift. Napoleon destroyed his own empire in the snows of Russia in 1812, and Prussia rose against him the following spring. Volunteers poured in. Students, craftsmen, professors of the new university. In October of 1813, at Leipzig, the largest battle Europe had yet seen broke Napoleon's power in Germany. In 1814, Prussian troops marched into Paris. They knew exactly what they had come to collect. The crates came home. The quadriga was hauled back to Berlin in triumph, and the architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel gave the goddess a new emblem for her return: an iron cross wreathed in oak leaves. The goddess of peace had become a goddess of victory. Berliners, with their talent for irreverence, took to calling her the Retour de Paris, the lady back from Paris. She had been a trophy of conquest. Now she was a monument to liberation. It would not be the last time her meaning was rewritten by whoever held the ground beneath her. What followed the wars was quieter and stranger. The kings, frightened by the popular energies they had summoned, clamped down. Censorship returned. Dissidents were watched, and the political promises of the reform years, above all the promise of a constitution, were quietly shelved. On the surface, Berlin in the 1820s and 30s was a tidy royal residence of growing fame and impeccable order, its centre adorned with Schinkel's serene museums and churches. Underneath, the ground was shifting, and to see how, follow one young man into the city. In 1823 or thereabouts, a carpenter's son from Breslau, named August Borsig, arrived in Berlin. He was in his late teens, trained with his hands, hungry in the way that only provincial newcomers to a capital are hungry. He found work in an iron foundry before the northern gates, learned the new science of machines, and watched, along with the whole city, as the first talk of railways crossed the German lands. In 1837, Borsig opened his own machine works by the Oranienburg Gate, A year later, the first Prussian railway steamed out of Berlin toward Potsdam, and Borsig bet everything on one product: locomotives. In 1841, his factory delivered its first engine. By the time he died in 1854, his works had built roughly 500 of them and stood among the largest locomotive builders on earth. And Berliners spoke of him the way Americans would later speak of Carnegie. A carpenter's son had become the Iron King of Prussia, and his factory chimneys announced a new Berlin that no palace had planned and no palace could control. Because around the factories, that new Berlin was filling with people. Workers streamed in from the countryside of Brandenburg, Silesia, and East Prussia, tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands, packing into hastily built tenements. The old sand of the glacial valley turned out to be perfect ground for this new age. Flat, cheap, and endless. You could build on it forever. And Berlin did. The royal stage was becoming a machine, and the machine was hungry. The machine was also angry. Wages were miserable. Housing was worse. And in 1847, famine prices brought riots to the city's food markets. Then, in the spring of 1848, revolution swept across Europe. Paris first, then Vienna, and on March 18th, Berlin. A huge crowd gathered before the royal palace, on the very island where Iron Tooth had built his fortress, cheering the king, demanding a constitution and a free press. The king appeared, seemingly ready to concede. Then, in the confusion, 2 shots from the soldiers went off, and the square exploded. Within hours, the city was a battlefield. Berliners tore up paving stones and built barricades. Hundreds of them. Workers, students, craftsmen, women passing ammunition. The casualty lists later compiled and published name respectable master tailors and teenage apprentices side by side. Through the night of March 18th, the army shelled and stormed the barricades, and by morning around 270 Berliners were dead, most of them workers and artisans. They are remembered as the March Fallen. And then came a scene no one in Prussia had ever imagined. The shaken king ordered the army out of his own capital, and on March 19th he stood bareheaded on the palace balcony as the bodies of the fallen were carried past in the courtyard below. The crowd singing a funeral hymn and demanding that he look. For one spring, the Unwilling of Berlin, the old unwillingness born under Iron Tooth, was in open command of the city. A Prussian National Assembly met. A constitution was drafted. It did not last. Revolutions rarely survive their first winter. By the end of 1848, the army was back. The assembly was dissolved, and the king imposed a constitution of his own design, keeping the crown firmly in charge. The revolution had failed, and its sharpest minds drew their conclusions and left. Among the German exiles of these years who crossed the Atlantic were men like Carl Schurz, later a United States Senator and Cabinet Secretary. America, the ultimate city of refugees, collected Berlin's disappointed Democrats. It would not be the last time. In Prussia, the lesson was drawn differently, and it was drawn most coldly by the man who took over the government in 1862. Otto von Bismarck told the Parliament, in a speech preserved in its records, that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches and majority resolutions. That had been the great mistake of 1848 and 49, but by iron and blood. He then spent 9 years proving it. A short war against Denmark in 1864, a lightning war against Austria in 1866, decided in 7 weeks, and in 1870, a war against France that ended with Paris besieged and a German victory so total it redrew the map of Europe. On January 18th, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the King of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor. Just like that, the swamp town, the twin villages in the wet sand, the garrison of the Soldier King, became the capital of the most powerful new state in Europe, an empire of over 40 million people. Berlin held roughly 800,000 inhabitants on the day the empire was proclaimed. Within a single generation it would more than double, becoming the fastest-growing great city in Europe, a place of electric light, world-changing science, and slums as dark as any on the continent. The machine was about to run at full speed, and nobody, not even Bismarck, had any idea where it was going. That electric metropolis is our next chapter. Chapter 6. The Electric Metropolis. Come back to the present for a moment, because this chapter is easier to feel than to explain. In the northeast of Berlin today, there is a small square called Kollwitzplatz, in a district named Prenzlauer Berg. On a Saturday morning, it is one of the gentlest places in the city. An organic market. Strollers. Children climbing on a playground. Cafes full of laptops. In the middle of the square sits a bronze statue of an old woman. Heavy, tired, watchful. The children climb on her too. Her name was Ketha Kollwitz. The square is named for her. And if you want to understand what Berlin was like when it became a metropolis, her life is the door, because in 1891, a young Kathe moved with her new husband into an apartment right here, when this gentle square stood in one of the poorest, most crowded corners of the fastest-growing city in Europe. Rewind to that Berlin, and start with the flood of money. France, defeated in 1871, was required to pay the new German Empire an enormous war indemnity of 5 billion francs. And it paid quickly. Much of that gold poured through Berlin, and the imperial capital went into a speculative frenzy that Germans still call the Gründerzeit, the Founders' Era. Hundreds of new companies, banks, and building societies appeared in barely 2 years. Then, in 1873, the Vienna stock market crashed. The panic spread to Berlin, and much of the paper fortune evaporated. It was a preview, in miniature, of a pattern this city would come to know intimately. Boom, crash, and the discovery that the boom had been partly built, like everything else here, on sand. But underneath the speculation, something real was happening. People were coming, in numbers no German city had ever seen. Berlin held about 800,000 inhabitants when the empire was proclaimed. By 1900 it was approaching 2 million. By 1910, over 2 million in the city proper, and well over 3 million counting the industrial suburbs. The city's own statistical yearbooks recorded the defining fact that most adult Berliners of this era had been born somewhere else. It was a city of newcomers, Silesian weavers' sons, East Prussian farm girls, Jewish families from the small towns of the East, all pulled toward the machine, and the machine needed housing. The answer Berlin built was the Mietskaserne, the rental barracks, and it deserves a moment of honest attention, because it shaped how millions of people actually lived. 5 stories high, built around a chain of inner courtyards, one behind another, so that a single street address could hide hundreds of residents. The building regulations required courtyards just large enough for a fire pump to turn around. a square of roughly 17 feet on a side, and landlords built precisely to that minimum. Sunlight was a luxury reserved for the front apartments facing the street. In the rear courtyards lived the workers, often a whole family to a room, the room shared with a Schlafbursche, a night lodger renting the bed for the hours the family did not use it. Wash hung across courtyards that never dried. Tuberculosis moved through the buildings like a resident. This is the Berlin Keith Kollwitz chose. She was a trained artist from a comfortable family, and her husband Karl was a doctor who ran a health insurance practice for workers, which meant the poorest patients in the district came through their door every day. Keith drew what came through the door: worn mothers, sick children, men used up at 40. Her great print cycles of the 1890s made her famous across Germany, and they still hang in museums on both sides of the Atlantic, because almost no one else recorded, with that much skill and that little sentimentality, what the electric Metropolis cost the people at the bottom of it. When Americans of the same era read about tenement New York, they were reading about Berlin's sibling. The two cities were twins in this. Vast, electric, and unequal. Hold on to Keith. Her story is not finished, and this city is going to break her heart. Electric is the precise word. In the 1880s and 90s, Berlin became the world capital of the new science of electricity, so much so that engineers across Europe called it Electropolis. Werner von Siemens built his telegraph workshop into a global corporation, and in 1881, the Berlin suburb of Lichterfelde opened the world's first electric streetcar line. Emil Rathenow bought the German rights to Edison's light bulb and built the electrical giant AEG. By 1902, Berlin had an elevated and underground electric railway. Electric light ran down the great avenues while the courtyards behind them stayed dark, and that contrast, glitter out front, shadow in back, is as good a portrait of imperial Berlin as any painting. The same generation rewrote science itself. In 1882, at a meeting of the Berlin Physiological Society, Robert Koch announced that he had identified the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, the very disease that stalked the courtyards, and modern medicine took one of its largest single steps. In 1900, at a session of the German Physical Society in Berlin, Max Planck presented the calculation that introduced the quantum. The idea that energy comes in discrete packets, and physics has never been the same since. In 1914, the rising star Albert Einstein was recruited to Berlin with a specially created position, and it was here, in 1915, that he completed the general theory of relativity. Within a few square miles, in one generation, humanity rewrote its understanding of disease, energy, and gravity. Whatever else this story becomes, do not forget that Berlin at its height was one of the great engines of human knowledge. Over it all presided an emperor who embodied the empire's strengths and its fatal flaw in one restless person, Wilhelm II, grandson of Queen Victoria, intelligent, energetic, wounded in body and in pride, dismissed the aging Bismarck in 1890 and set out to steer world politics himself. He loved technology, uniforms, battleships, and speeches, and his speeches had a way of alarming the world. The record of his reign reads like a study in talent without judgment. Berlin's businessmen built global companies. Berlin's scientists collected Nobel Prizes, and Berlin's government drifted, step by step, into a naval race with Britain and an alliance system with no exits. In the summer of 1914, the exits closed. An assassination in Sarajevo, An ultimatum, mobilization, and on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. That evening, crowds gathered along Unter den Linden singing patriotic hymns, and the photographs of those cheering crowds became famous. Historians now add a caution that the pictures show one Berlin and not the other. The working-class districts were notably quieter, and the socialists had led large peace demonstrations only days earlier. Even at the brink, this was a divided city. In the Kollwitz household, the war arrived as a boy in a new uniform. Peter, the youngest son, was 18, and he needed his father's signature to volunteer. Karl was against it. Peter pleaded. Käthe, torn, persuaded her husband to sign, and her diaries record the whole scene. In October of 1914, within weeks of reaching the front in Flanders, Peter was killed. His mother spent much of the rest of her life working on a memorial sculpture, a mother and father on their knees, and her diaries trace her long transformation from the patriotic grief of 1914 into one of the most famous pacifists in Europe. One family, one door on one poor square, and through it walked the whole story of that generation. For the city, the war meant not battle, but slow strangulation. The British naval blockade cut Germany off from world trade, and the metropolis of 2 million began. Quite simply, to run out of food. Rationing started with bread in 1915 and spread to nearly everything. The winter of 1916-17 entered memory as the turnip winter, when the potato harvest failed and turnips, normally animal feed, became the staple of the Berlin table. Post-war German accounting attributed several 100,000 civilian deaths nationwide to the blockade and malnutrition, a figure historians still debate. But the daily reality in Berlin needed no statistics. School doctors measured the children shrinking. Women stood in line before dawn for rations that thinned by the month. And it was in those bread lines, not in any parliament, that the empire quietly lost its people. By the autumn of 1918, the army was beaten in the field. The Navy's sailors were in open mutiny, and revolution rolled across Germany city by city. On November 9th, 1918, it reached Berlin, and the empire ended not with a battle, but with an announcement. The Kaiser's abdication was declared, and he fled into exile in the Netherlands. That same afternoon, from a window of the Reichstag building, the Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed a German republic to the crowds below. About 2 hours later, and 1 mile away, from the palace, the radical socialist Karl Liebknecht proclaimed a different republic, a socialist one. 2 proclamation, 2 visions, 1 city, 1 afternoon. Berlin's next 14 years would be a fight to the death between them, and between both of them and something darker than either. It would begin with machine guns in the streets within 8 weeks. That fight, and the wildest, freest, most creative decade this city ever lived, are our next chapter. Chapter 7. Babylon, Berlin. The Republic proclaimed from the Reichstag window was born fighting for its life, and its first battlefield was Berlin itself. In January of 1919, radical socialists and communists tried to push the revolution further, seizing the newspaper district in what became known as the Spartacist Uprising. The new social democratic government, lacking a reliable army, turned to a weapon it would never fully control: the Freikorps, volunteer units of demobilized soldiers, hard men brutalized by 4 years of war and contemptuous of the republic they were hired to defend. They retook Berlin street by street. And on January 15th, 1919, Freikorps officers captured the movement's two most famous leaders, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Both were murdered that night. Luxemburg's body thrown into the Landwehr Canal. The men most responsible received trivial sentences or none at all. Mark that carefully. In the new Republic, political murder from the right was, from the very first weeks, treated more gently than dissent from the left. That imbalance would cost this republic everything. The violence kept coming. In March 1920, rebellious Freikorps units seized the government district in the Kapp Putsch, and the legitimate government fled the city. What saved the republic, which largely stood aside? But the workers of Berlin, who answered with a general strike so complete that the coup died of paralysis within days. No power, no transport, no water, no newspapers. The unwill of Berlin had saved German democracy with its arms folded. And in the middle of the chaos, the city itself was transformed by a single law. In 1920, the Greater Berlin Act merged the old city with 7 surrounding towns and dozens of villages and estates into one enormous municipality. Overnight, Berlin nearly doubled its population to almost 4 million and became, by area, one of the largest cities on earth. The stage was now vast. The play performed on it during the next decade would be unlike anything Europe had seen. But first, the money had to die. Germany had financed the war through debt, and after defeat came reparations. The government, unable to tax enough and unwilling to default, printed money. In 1923, after French troops occupied the Ruhr industrial region and Berlin backed passive resistance there with yet more printing, the currency simply dissolved. The numbers from that autumn read like a fever dream, and they are documented in the daily exchange quotations of the period. In January 1923, 1 United States dollar bought about 18,000 marks. By that November, $1 bought roughly 4.2 trillion marks. A loaf of bread in Berlin cost billions. Wages were paid daily, then twice daily, and spent within the hour. Workers hauling banknotes in laundry baskets and wheelbarrows. Restaurants stopped printing prices. Savings built across a lifetime of Prussian thrift became waste paper. And there are photographs from that year of children stacking bundles of currency into play castles. Money more useful as toy blocks than as money. Here is the point Americans should carry away, because it corrects a common shortcut. It was not the hyperinflation that put Hitler in power. Not directly. The inflation was stabilized in late 1923 with a new currency, and the Republic survived another decade. What the inflation truly destroyed was invisible and permanent. It destroyed the middle-class belief that the world was fair, that saving was rewarded, that the state protected the diligent. The ground under respectable Berlin turned out to be sand, and everyone who had trusted it remembered the feeling of it giving way. The crash that actually opened the door for the Nazis came later, from Wall Street. The inflation had simply removed the locks. Yet the very same city, in the very same decade, produced one of the most dazzling cultural explosions in modern history. The Golden Twenties in Berlin were real, and they were not merely parties. This was the Berlin where Fritz Lang filmed Metropolis at the Babelsberg Studios, one of the most expensive films Europe had yet attempted, where a Berlin-born performer named Marlene Dietrich became a world star overnight in The Blue Angel, where Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill premiered the Threepenny Opera in 1928 and handed the century one of its most performed works of theatre. The city supported well over 100 newspapers and 3 opera houses, and its scientists collected Nobel Prizes with almost annual regularity. Einstein chief among its celebrities, by now so famous that Berliners pointed him out on the street, and it was free in ways that startle even now. Berlin in the 20s held a famously open gay and lesbian scene, with dozens of clubs and its own publications, and at the Institute for Sexual Science, founded by the physician Magnus Hirschfeld in 1919. Researchers pioneered the scientific study of sexuality and gender. Visitors from Paris, London, and New York came to be shocked and generally succeeded. The English writer Christopher Isherwood lived in this Berlin and turned it into the stories that eventually became the musical Cabaret, which is, for most Americans, the window through which this whole era is seen. It is a fair window. As long as you remember what Isherwood's Berlin stories themselves never let you forget, that the party was danced on top of a volcano. The volcano had a voice, and from 1926 it had a manager in Berlin. The Nazi Party sent a young propagandist named Joseph Goebbels to take over its tiny, struggling Berlin organization, and he chose strategy over popularity, deliberate provocation, street battles with communists in the working-class districts, martyrs manufactured for the cause, a party newspaper called Der Angriff, the attack, whose name was its entire philosophy. He knew exactly what he was fighting, and he said so in his own published writing, complaining that Berlin was the reddest city in Europe after Moscow. He was not wrong about the colour, and here is the twist in this story that most tellings skip. The fact this channel wants you to hold on to. Berlin never handed Hitler a victory at the ballot box. In every free election of the Republic, this city remained one of the weakest major cities in Germany for the Nazi Party. In the last fully free national election, in November 1932, the Nazis took about 33% across Germany, but in Red Berlin only around 26%, while the two workers' parties together took roughly half the city's vote. Even in March 1933, with Hitler already Chancellor, the police in Nazi hands and the opposition press strangled, Berlin's recorded result stayed clearly below the national figure. The future capital of the Third Reich was, by its own ballots, one of the least Nazi big cities in the country. The dictatorship was not carried into Berlin by its people. It was imposed on Berlin from above, exactly as Iron Tooth's palace had been. The city's new rulers knew it, and they never forgave the city for it. None of that mattered in the end, because the Republic was not murdered by voters. It was handed over, after the Wall Street crash of 1929 pulled the credit out of the German economy. Unemployment in Berlin climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Soup kitchen lines wrapped around the tenement blocks of the very courtyards Keith Kollwitz had drawn, and the streets belonged to fighting formations of left and right, a shrinking circle of aging conservatives around President Hindenburg, men who despised the Republic and imagined they could hire the Nazi movement as a battering ram against the left, made their calculation. One of them, Franz von Papen, assured a doubter, in a remark preserved in the memoir literature of that winter, that within 2 months they would have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he would squeak. On the evening of January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and tens of thousands of stormtroopers celebrated with a torchlight parade through the Brandenburg Gate, under the Quadriga, through the heart of the city that had never chosen them. Somewhere along Unter den Linden, Berliners stood watching in silence. Many assumed, like the conservatives, like the diplomats, like most of the world's newspapers, that this loud government would last a season and collapse like the ones before it. The Reichstag, the parliament building whose window had birthed the Republic, stood a few hundred yards from the parade route. Within 4 weeks, it would be on fire. That fire, and the 12 years of darkness it ignited, are our next chapter. Chapter 8. The Nazi Capital. On the night of February 27th, 1933, 4 weeks after the torchlight parade, Berliners looked toward the government district and saw the dome of the Reichstag glowing orange against the winter sky. The Parliament of Germany was burning. A young Dutch council communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested inside the building and confessed to setting the fire alone. Historians have debated the full story for 90 years, and the honest summary is that most scholarship today accepts that van der Lubbe acted alone, while noting that the question has never entirely closed. But for this story, the debate almost does not matter. What matters is the speed of what followed, because it was the speed of men who did not intend to waste a crisis. The very next day, President Hindenburg signed the Reichstag fire decree, suspending, in 1 page of text, the basic rights of the German constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of a press, freedom of assembly, protection from arbitrary arrest, all gone by signature. In a single morning, it was presented as a temporary emergency measure. It remained in force for 12 years. The arrests began that same night. Thousands of communists and social democrats, the very people who had won half of Berlin's votes months earlier. In March, the first improvised camps and torture cellars opened around the city, and in the working-class strongholds, the stormtroopers settled personal scores with the neighborhoods that had fought them for years. Red Berlin, the city that had never handed Hitler a victory, was broken first, precisely because it had never handed him one. Then came the fire that was aimed at the mind. On the night of May 10th, 1933, on the square beside the university that Humboldt had founded to set knowledge free, students and stormtroopers built a pyre and burned tens of thousands of books. Works by Einstein, by Freud, by Heinrich Mann, by the American Helen Keller, who answered with a famous open letter to the students of Germany. Goebbels himself gave the speech at the flames. Today, set into that square, there is a memorial by the Israeli artist Micah Ullman, a glass window in the pavement looking down into a white underground room of empty bookshelves, enough shelf space for roughly the number of books burned. Beside it, a plaque carries a line the poet Heinrich Heine had written in the early 1820s, more than a century before. Where they burn books, they will in the end also burn people. Berlin would live to prove its own poet right. The exodus began at once, and pause on what it meant, because this is the chapter where the city of refugees reverses. For 250 years, Berlin had grown by taking in the persecuted. Now it became a place people fled. Einstein, travelling in America when Hitler took power, never returned, and his Berlin apartment was searched within weeks. Within a few years, a large share of the scientists, filmmakers, writers, and musicians who had made Berlin the most exciting city in Europe were gone, and their destination, more often than anywhere else, was the United States. Fritz Lang to Hollywood, Marlene Dietrich to Hollywood, where she became an American citizen and one of the most defiantly anti-Nazi voices in her new country. The physicists to Princeton and Chicago, where some of them would later help build the weapon that ended the war in the Pacific. It is one of history's starkest transfers of talent. And America was the receiver. When Americans ask why the atomic bomb, the modern film industry, and half of post-war science speak with a German accent. A large part of the answer is that Berlin expelled its own genius. For those who could not leave, or would not, the city changed by increments. The Nazis understood spectacle, and in 1936 they were handed the greatest stage on earth. The Olympic Games had been awarded to Berlin before Hitler came to power, and the regime turned them into a masterpiece of image management. The anti-Semitic signs came down for 2 weeks. The city was scrubbed. The persecution paused for the cameras, and many foreign visitors went home reporting a clean, orderly, friendly Germany. It worked on many. It did not work on everyone, and the games contained one moment the regime could not script. The American runner Jesse Owens, a black sharecropper's son from Alabama, won 4 gold medals in the Olympic Stadium, and the Berlin crowds, to the visible discomfort of their leadership, cheered him loudly. The newsreels could not hide it. The fastest man on earth had refuted the entire racial theory of the state hosting him, in its own capital, and ordinary Berliners had applauded. 2 years later, the mask came off entirely. On the night of November 9th, 1938, the regime unleashed a coordinated pogrom across Germany, and Berlin, home to the country's largest Jewish community, roughly 160,000 people when the Nazi years began, suffered accordingly. Synagogues burned across the city, while fire brigades stood by with orders to protect only the neighbouring buildings. The windows of Jewish shops were smashed by the thousands, littering the sidewalks with the shards that gave the night its bitter name. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across the country, Jewish men were arrested by the tens of thousands and sent to concentration camps. And mark the date, November 9th, the Republic proclaimed in 1918, the pogrom in 1938. This calendar date will return in this story one more time. Transformed. Hitler, meanwhile, had plans for the city itself, and they reveal exactly how he saw it. With his architect Albert Speer, he designed a total rebuilding of Berlin into a world capital to be called Germania. Its centerpiece, a domed hall, so vast that Speer calculated, in his own post-war memoirs, that the breath of its assembled crowds would condense into clouds beneath the ceiling, a grand avenue wider than any in Paris, a triumphal arch that would dwarf Napoleon's. It was megalomania in stone, and it had a practical dark side that is often forgotten, to clear ground for Germania. Thousands of Berlin Jews were forced out of their apartments, an administrative rehearsal for what was coming. And here the oldest character in this story quietly stepped forward. The sand. Before building an arch heavier than anything ever attempted, Speer's engineers had to answer a question the Parisii fishermen could have answered for free. Would the wet Berlin ground hold? In 1941, they poured a monstrous test cylinder of concrete, over 12,000 tons of it, in the district of Tempelhof, fitted with instruments to measure how far it would sink. It is still there today. It is called the Schwerbelastungskörper, the heavy load-bearing body, and it still stands because it is too massive to safely demolish. A monument to a city that was never built. The measurements it produced showed the ground sinking well past the acceptable limits. The swamp had voted. The only vote the regime could not rig. Germania, among all its other impossibilities, would have drowned in the sand. The regime never got the chance to argue with the ground, because it chose war instead. On September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and this time there were no cheering crowds on Unter den Linden. The American correspondent William Shearer walked the city that day and recorded in his Berlin diary a population that was apathetic, grim, and silent. Berliners remembered the turnip winter. They knew, better than their government believed, what a world war meant for a city that could be starved. They were right to be grim, but no memory of the last war could prepare them for what was coming to this one. The next chapter is the hardest one in this story. Chapter 9. The Destruction. There is a train platform in the wealthy west of Berlin, in the leafy district of Grunewald, where the commuter trains still stop every day. Walk to the end of it and you find track number 17, Gleis 17. Along its edge, set into the ground, run steel plates, one for each transport that left this platform, each plate cast with a date, a number of people, and a destination. October 18th, 1941. 1,251 Jews. Litzmannstadt, then Riga, then Warsaw, then, from 1942 onward, again and again and again, Auschwitz. Begin the story of Berlin's destruction here. Not with the bombs, because this is the destruction Berlin carried out, before the one it suffered. More than 50,000 Berlin Jews were deported from this city's stations, Grunewald among them, between the autumn of 1941 and the end of the war, and murdered in the ghettos and camps of the East. This was not hidden in some distant countryside. The assembly points were in the middle of town, a synagogue on Lewitzowstrasse, an old people's home on Gross Hamburger Strasse. Neighbours watched the columns walk to the trains. Furniture from the emptied apartments was auctioned publicly, and in January 1942, when leading officials of the regime met to coordinate what they called the final solution of the Jewish question, they met in Berlin, in a comfortable villa on the Wannsee Lake, in the same district of lakes and gardens where Einstein had once kept his summer house. The minutes of that meeting survive. One copy, found after the war. The villa is a memorial today. You can stand in the room. The industrial murder of Europe's Jews was administered from this city, by educated men at desks, between lunch and coffee. Honesty also requires the other side of this ledger, because it exists, and it is small, and its smallness is the point. Roughly 1,700 Berlin Jews survived the entire war hidden inside the city, in attics, in garden colonies, behind false walls, protected by Berliners who risked their lives to feed people the state wanted dead. There were flashes of open defiance too. In February 1943, after the regime arrested the Jewish husbands of non-Jewish German women, hundreds of those wives gathered day after day on Rosenstrasse, in the heart of the city, calling for their husbands, in public, unarmed, in the capital of a police state. The men of that group were, in the end, released, and historians still debate exactly why. And a Berlin factory owner named Otto Weidt, running a small workshop for the blind that made brushes and brooms, bribed and forged and lied to the Gestapo for years to protect his Jewish workers. His little workshop survives as a museum, tucked in a courtyard, a few minutes' walk from the grand avenues. These stories matter, not because they balance the crime. Nothing balances the crime, but because they prove that choice existed. Some chose, most did not. While the trains rolled east, the war came home through the air. The British bombed Berlin as early as 1940. But the true storm began in November 1943, when the Royal Air Force opened the campaign its own commander called the Battle of Berlin. Months of massed night raids on the city centre. From 1944, the Americans came by day. Berliners learned the rhythm that structured the rest of their war. The sirens, the cellar, the crash of the guns on the giant concrete flak towers, the all clear, the count of who was missing. In a single week of raids, in late November 1943, whole districts of the West End burned out, and the church at the heart of the Kurfürstendamm shopping boulevard was left the jagged ruin that West Berliners would later keep, unrepaired, as their own memorial. By the end, Allied bombing surveys recorded square mile after square mile of the city centre destroyed, and estimates placed the number of Berliners killed by the air war over the whole course of it somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000, with the true figure probably never to be known exactly. Berlin was not even unique in this. Hamburg had burned worse in one single week, and the fate Berlin's own government had first delivered to Warsaw. Rotterdam and Coventry had set the precedent, but the capital was the symbol, and the symbol was ground down, month after month, for a year and a half. The city that endured this was, by 1944, a city of women, children, old men, and slaves. That word is precise. At the war's height, hundreds of thousands of forced labourers, prisoners of war and civilians rounded up across occupied Europe, worked in Berlin's factories, including the proud old names of Electropolis, Siemens and AEG among them. Their camps stood in every district. Berliners passed them on the way to work. This, too, happened in full view. And what of Keith Kollwitz, the artist of the courtyards, whom we followed into this century? She was still in Berlin as the bombs began, an old woman now, long forbidden to exhibit by the regime she despised. In 1943 she was evacuated from the city, and weeks later her apartment on the square that today bears her name was destroyed in a raid, with decades of her prints and plates inside. She died in April 1945, 2 weeks before the war's end, having outlived her son Peter, killed in the First War, and her grandson Peter, named for him and killed in the Second. One family, one door, 2 world wars. Her statue sits today on that gentle square, watching the children climb. By April 1945, the front itself arrived. The Soviet Union had fought its way back across 1,000 miles from Stalingrad, at a cost in lives without equal in modern history, and its 2 great army groups now raced each other toward the city. The battle for Berlin began on April 16th, with one of the heaviest artillery bombardments ever fired, on the Oder River heights east of the city, and within a week Berlin was encircled. Against roughly 1.5 million Soviet troops, the capital was defended by broken divisions, police units, and, most terribly, by the Volkssturm militia of old men and boys of the Hitler Youth, some of them 14 years old, sent against tanks with handheld rockets. Photographs from those days show children in oversized helmets being decorated for bravery by the last visitors to the bunker. Because under the garden of the ruined chancellery, in a concrete bunker deep in the wet Berlin ground, the man who had planned Germania now moved flags representing armies that no longer existed. The bunker testimonies collected after the war describe him waiting, in those final days, for the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, the salvation that had rescued Frederick the Great in 1762. When news came that President Roosevelt had died, on April 12th, the bunker briefly celebrated. The miracle, they believed, had come again. It had not. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet soldiers a few hundred yards away, Hitler shot himself. 2 days later, the Berlin garrison surrendered. Over the shell-scarred Reichstag, whose burning had opened this era 12 years before, Soviet soldiers raised a red banner, and the photograph went around the world. The price of the final battle was immense on every side. Soviet records list over 300,000 casualties in the Berlin operation, including some 80,000 dead. German military deaths in the battle are estimated in the tens of thousands, and civilian deaths in the tens of thousands more, with exact figures still debated, and upon the surviving population, overwhelmingly women, children, and the old. Soldiers of the conquering army inflicted a wave of sexual violence that German memory long suppressed and serious history now documents. Mass rape, on a scale that scholars estimate in the tens of thousands of victims in Berlin alone. It is a brutal thing to say plainly. It belongs in the record. When the guns stopped in May 1945, Berlin held perhaps 2.8 million people, down from 4.3 million before the war. They were living in cellars beneath a landscape that visitors again and again compared to the surface of the moon. The state that had ruled them had ceased to exist. The men who had led it were dead, captured, or fleeing. Of the city's Jewish community, one of the glories of European civilization, a few thousand remained out of 160,000. The Germans have a phrase for that moment, Stunde Null, 0 hour, the point where a clock starts again from nothing. And in the moonscape, almost immediately, lines of survivors formed among the craters, passing bricks from hand to hand. What none of them could know was that their broken city was about to become the most contested piece of ground on the planet, and that the armies now sharing its ruins would, within 3 years, bring the world to the edge of another war, over the question of who feeds Berlin. That astonishing story is our next chapter. Chapter 10. Year Zero and the Airlift. Start with the bricks, because the rebuilding of Berlin did. In the summer of 1945, the occupation authorities ordered the city's adults into clearance work, and with so many men dead, captive, or missing, a great share of Berlin's rubble passed through women's hands. Germans came to call them the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Historians have since examined the legend carefully, and the researcher Leonie Trieber has shown that in West Germany as a whole, the image was later romanticized well beyond the reality. But in Berlin itself, the photographs, the pay records, and the survivors' accounts leave no doubt that women in their tens of thousands stood in the chains among the wreckage, passing bricks one by one, chipping off the old mortar so each brick could be used again, sorting a destroyed civilization into neat, reusable stacks. The debris they could not reuse was hauled to the city's edges and piled into artificial hills, one of the highest points in Berlin today. A hill called Teufelsberg in the Western Forest is not a natural hill at all. It is roughly 26 million cubic meters of the old Berlin, heaped over the ruins of an unfinished Nazi military college and grassed over. Berliners sled on their own catastrophe in winter. Remember the sand this city was built on. Now the sand had mountains, and the mountains were made of the 20th century. The city these women were clearing was no longer one city. At the wartime conferences, the Allies had agreed to divide defeated Germany into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, and Berlin, though it lay 100 miles deep inside the Soviet zone, was itself split 4 ways as the seat of the joint occupation. Look at that arrangement on a map and you can see the trap being set. The western sectors of Berlin were an island, some 2 million people, connected to the western zones of Germany only by designated road, rail, and canal routes across Soviet-held territory, plus 3 narrow air corridors that had been formally guaranteed in writing in 1945. Every meal in West Berlin arrived, in effect, by permission of Moscow. As long as the wartime Allies remained allies, this was an inconvenience. The wartime Allies did not remain allies. The breakdown came fast, and Berlin was where the world watched it happen. The Soviets stripped their zone of factories as reparations. The Western powers, drawing the opposite lesson from the 1920s, concluded that a starving Germany would breed the next war, and moved to rebuild their zones, announcing the Marshall Plan in 1947. In June 1948, the Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, into their zones and then into West Berlin. For Stalin, this was the final provocation, a rival German state taking shape, with a capitalist showcase sitting inside his own zone. He reached for the weapon the map had given him. On June 24th, 1948, Soviet authorities closed all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, citing technical difficulties. The electricity supplied from the eastern sector was cut the same day. 2 million people, in a half-ruined city, had food stocks for roughly a month and coal for 6 weeks. The calculation in Moscow was simple and, on paper, sound. The Western powers would either abandon Berlin, humiliating themselves before all of Europe, or try to force the Autobahn and start a war nobody believed they would risk. 2 choices, both bad. The American military governor, General Lucius Clay, believed abandoning Berlin meant abandoning Europe, and said so in blunt cables to Washington that are preserved in the official records. But it was the air corridors, those 3 strips of guaranteed sky, that offered the third choice nobody in Moscow had taken seriously. Feed a city of 2 million entirely by aeroplane. Experts on both sides considered it impossible. The daily minimum was calculated in the thousands of tons. Food, medicina, and coal, by airplane. It had never been done anywhere. It could not be done. They did it anyway. The airlift began within days. American and British transports landing at Tempelhof and Gatow, joined later by a brand new airfield at Tegel that Berliners, thousands of rubble women among the workforce, helped build in under 3 months. What began as improvisation became, under the American General William Tunner, a machine of almost musical precision. Aircraft landing at the peak of the operation as often as every minute or so around the clock. Pilots forbidden to circle. One approach: land or go home. Through the fog and ice of the winter of 1948 to 49, the machine kept running. By spring it was delivering more supply tonnage per day than the trains had carried before the blockade. On one record day in April 1949, remembered as the Easter Parade, the airlift landed nearly 13,000 tons in 24 hours. It was not bloodless. More than 70 airmen and civilians died in crashes over the course of the operation. British and American names now engraved on the airlift memorial at Tempelhof. And inside the story of the machine there is a smaller story that Americans especially should know, because it changed how two nations saw each other. An American pilot named Gail Halvorsen, chatting with Berlin children at the Tempelhof fence, noticed that they asked not for food, but for the one thing they had stopped hoping for. And he began dropping candy to them from his aircraft on little parachutes made of handkerchiefs, wiggling his wings on approach so they would know his plane. He did it first without permission. When his commanders found out, they made it official, and Operation Little Victuals eventually dropped tons of candy over the city, much of it donated by American school children and candy companies. Berliners called him the candy bomber and the uncle who wiggles his wings, and when he died in 2022, at the age of 101, the city mourned him like a native son. Stop and take in the reversal, because there is almost nothing like it in modern history. In 1945, the sound of American engines over Berlin meant death, and the children of this city were taught to run from it. 3 years later, the same engines, flown in some cases by the same men, meant food, heat, and candy drifting down on handkerchief parachutes. The enemy had become the protector, not through a treaty, but through 15 months of visible, physical effort. Flour sack by flour sack, in front of the children at the fence, West Berliners, whose own leaders, like the fiery mayor Ernst Reuter, had stood before the world begging it not to abandon them, drew a conclusion that would hold for 2 generations: the Americans stay. Stalin drew his own conclusion. The blockade had failed, and it had accelerated everything he feared. A Western military alliance, NATO, was founded in April 1949. A West German state followed in May. On May 12, 1949, the barriers on the Autobahn lifted, and the first trucks rolled into a West Berlin lit up with celebration. That October, the Soviet zone answered with a state of its own, the German Democratic Republic, its capital in East Berlin. So the decade closed with 2 Germanys, 2 Berlins, and a line through the middle of the old capital that was, for now, still just a line on the pavement. You could cross it to visit your grandmother, to go to work, to see a movie. Hundreds of thousands did, every single day. 12 years later, a generation of Berliners would wake up one Sunday morning to discover that the line had become a cage, built overnight, through cemeteries and living rooms, and that some of them were standing on the wrong side of it. That morning is our next chapter. Chapter 11. The Wall Goes Up. Through the 1950s, divided Berlin ran an experiment no one had designed. 2 economic systems, 2 ideologies, 1 city, 1 language, 1 subway network, and an open border down the middle. People could compare with their own eyes, and then they could walk. The experiment produced a verdict, and the verdict was measured in footsteps, moving west. The numbers were catastrophic for the East, and they are documented in the registration records of the West German refugee camps. Between 1949 and 1961, roughly 2.7 million people left East Germany, the great majority through Berlin, where crossing from the Soviet sector to a Western one could be as simple as riding the subway 2 stops. And it was not a random crowd. The leavers were disproportionately young, skilled, and educated. Doctors, engineers, teachers, exactly the people a rebuilding state could not lose. East Germany, a country of about 17 million, was bleeding out through a hole in its own capital. In the summer of 1961, the flow became a flood. More than 30,000 in July alone, driven by rumours that the door would soon close. The East German leader, Walter Ulbricht, had been demanding that door closed for years, and Moscow had hesitated, fearing the world's reaction. On June 15th, 1961, at an international press conference, Ulbricht produced one of the most infamous sentences of the century, answering a question no one had quite asked. "No one," he said, "has the intention of building a wall." It was the first time anyone in authority had spoken the word aloud. Berliners heard it, and the departure numbers spiked. 2 months later, with Moscow's approval finally secured, he built it. It began in the small hours of Sunday, August 13th, 1961, a date chosen precisely because the city would be asleep and half of it away for the summer weekend. Just after midnight, East German police, troops, and factory militias rolled out along the entire 100-mile boundary around West Berlin and began tearing up streets and stringing barbed wire. Subway and commuter rail lines between the halves were severed. Stations bricked shut. Berliners on both sides woke on Sunday morning to soldiers, wire, and crowds standing in stunned silence at streets they had crossed their whole lives. Families that had said "see you next week" the previous evening would, in many cases, not sit in the same room again for a generation. The concrete followed within days, and over the years the improvised barrier grew into a system. Understand what the finished Berlin Wall actually was, because the single graffiti-covered slab in American museums does not show it. It was 2 walls, with a floodlit corridor in between that Berliners called the death strip, raked sand to show footprints, the Berlin sand, conscripted at last into the service of a border, tripwires, guard towers, dog runts, standing orders to shoot. The East German state called it the anti-fascist protection rampart, and here the record deserves one plain sentence. Every element of it, the guns, the dogs, the raked sand, faced inward, at the state's own citizens. People immediately began trying to get out, and the first weeks produced images the world has never forgotten. On August 15th, 2 days in, a 19-year-old East German border guard named Konrad Schumann, posted at a half-finished section of wire, suddenly ran, leaping the coil in full uniform, rifle flung aside in mid-air, a moment caught by a Western photographer and printed everywhere on earth, in the border houses of Bernauer Strasse, where the building line itself was the frontier. Residents jumped from upper windows into rescue nets held by West Berlin firefighters, while East German police broke down their doors behind them. Some made it, some did not. The first person to die at the wall was one of these window jumpers, a 58-year-old nurse named Ida Siekmann, who on August 22nd, 1961, threw her bedding from her third-floor window on Bernauer Strasse and jumped after it before the firefighters below could fully spread the net. She died of her injuries on the way to the hospital. 1 day before her birthday, 2 days after that, a 24-year-old tailor named Günther Litvin became the first person shot dead at the new border, killed by police bullets while swimming a canal toward West Berlin. The windows of Bernauer Strasse were soon bricked up, then the houses emptied, then demolished, leaving only the wall. And then came the death that defined the structure's meaning for the world. On August 17th, 1962, an 18-year-old bricklayer named Peter Fechter was shot crossing the death strip near Checkpoint Charlie and fell at the foot of the wall on the eastern side. in full view of the west. He lay there crying for help for the better part of an hour. While East German guards held back, Western onlookers screamed across the barrier, and American soldiers at the checkpoint stood under orders not to cross. He bled to death in front of cameras. The photographs went around the world, and West Berliners rioted in fury, some of it aimed at the Americans who had stood still. Researchers at the Berlin Wall Memorial and the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam have since documented at least 140 people who died at the Berlin Wall between 1961 and 1989, and they publish every name. Why did the West stand still? It is the hard question of this chapter, and the honest answer is arithmetic. President Kennedy, at his family home when the wire went up, grasped the logic within days, and his assessment, recorded by his aides and quoted in the standard histories of the crisis, was brutally clear. A wall, he observed, was not war, and it was a great deal better than one. East Germany's collapse from mass flight would have forced Moscow towards something far more dangerous. So the West protested, reinforced its garrison, and sent Vice President Johnson to reassure the city. But it accepted the wall as the price of avoiding nuclear war over Berlin. For West Berliners, protection and abandonment arrived in the same gesture, and they knew it. How close the other outcome ran became visible in October 1961. At the crossing point, the Americans called Checkpoint Charlie, a dispute over whether East German police could demand documents from American officials escalated day by day until, on October 27th, 10 American tanks and 10 Soviet tanks faced each other across the checkpoint at a distance of about 100 yards. Engines running, guns loaded, for some 16 hours. It was one of the only moments in the entire Cold War when American and Soviet tanks pointed loaded barrels at each other directly. Through back-channel messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev, both sides pulled back one tank at a time. Each withdrawal mirrored, until the street was empty. The crisis dissolved. The lesson stood. Neither superpower would die for Berlin, and both would now keep it exactly as it was. So the cage settled into permanence. East Germany stabilized behind its wall. Its hemorrhage stopped by force. West Berlin adjusted to life as a walled island, subsidized, garrisoned, and defiant. And in June 1963, John F. Kennedy came to see the wall for himself, stood on a platform before a vast crowd of West Berliners at the Schöneberg City Hall, and delivered, in his Boston accent, 4 words of German that the crowd received like a covenant. Ich bin ein Berliner, all free men, he told them, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. The wall would stand for 28 years. On its 2 sides, 2 utterly different cities would now grow from the same root, one watched by an army of informers, the other reinventing itself as the strangest island in the Western world. Those 2 cities, and the 2 lives of one divided people, are our next chapter. Chapter 12. 2 cities. 1 wound. Walk down a quiet street in the Schöneberg district today. Hauptstraße, number 1, 55. It is an ordinary Berlin apartment house. A bakery smell. A bicycle chained by the door. On the wall beside the entrance there is a plaque with a lightning bolt, and on most days, flowers beneath it. A rock star lived here once, in the walled city, and we will come back to him, because his story and this plaque are the strangest proof of what West Berlin became. But first, cross the wall and go east, because the east is harder to see, and it deserves to be seen honestly. East Berlin was the capital and showcase of the German Democratic Republic, and the state poured resources into making it presentable. The television tower rose above Alexanderplatz in 1969. At 368 meters, still the tallest structure in Germany today. Its steel sphere visible from almost everywhere in the city. Which was the point. Life beneath it was not the grey cartoon Americans sometimes imagine. There was work for everyone. Rent cost almost nothing. Childcare was universal. And for many families, life was orderly, modest, and secure in ways some East Germans genuinely valued and some still remember with warmth. The historical record requires that honesty. It also requires the other half. The same state that guaranteed your job was reading your mail. The Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, grew into one of the most extensive surveillance machines ever built. The files preserved today by the German Federal Archives document roughly 90,000 full-time employees at the end, plus well over 100,000 unofficial informers, neighbors, colleagues, in documented cases, spouses, and in sheer surveillance density, in the number of watchers per citizen. Researchers who have studied the files conclude that the Stasi exceeded even what the Gestapo had built. To be clear, that is a comparison of surveillance, not of crimes, but as surveillance. It had no equal. When the files were opened after unification, Germans were given the legal right to read their own, and thousands discovered the informer in their lives by name. Imagine opening a folder and finding your best friend's handwriting. That is not a metaphor. That happened, case after case, and the files run for mile after mile of shelving. Daily life threaded itself through this machine. You waited over a decade for a Trabant car and told jokes about it while you waited. Quietly, to the right people. You watched West German television every night. Illegally, along with most of the country, so that East Berliners lived with a nightly split screen. Socialism out the window, the West in the living room. You learned which sentences belonged at home and which could go outside. Children learned it too, without being taught. That is what the files do not quite capture. The small daily arithmetic of caution, performed by millions, for decades, now cross back, and the strangeness flips. West Berlin was a walled island of 2 million people, 100 miles inside a hostile country, kept alive by subsidies from West Germany and defended by American, British, and French garrisons it could never have survived without. By every rule of economics, it should have been a dying city. Instead, it became one of the oddest and most creative places in the Western world. And the reason is a beautiful accident of law. Because West Berlin technically remained under occupation status, its young men were exempt from the West German military draft. So for decades, every West German kid who refused to carry a rifle had one obvious address. The island filled with objectors, artists, students, anarchists, and dreamers, living cheaply in bullet-scarred tenements the speculators had given up on. Out of that soil grew the West Berlin of legend. The student revolt of the late 60s burned hottest here, ignited when a policeman shot a student named Benno Ohnesorg during a demonstration in 1967, a death that radicalized a generation. Squatters took over entire blocks in Kreuzberg. The district pressed hardest against the wall, where Turkish immigrant families, punks, and painters shared the same cheap streets, something like the Brooklyn of the Cold War. Decades before Brooklyn was Brooklyn, the wall itself, on its western face, disappeared under paint. Tourists photographed it, Artists treated it as the world's longest canvas, and West Berliners perfected the art of living with their backs to it. And in 1976, a rock star fleeing his own fame and his own habits in Los Angeles moved into the apartment at Hauptstrasse 155. David Bowie lived in West Berlin for roughly 2 years, sharing the flat for a time with Iggy Pop, riding a bicycle to the Hansa recording studio, which stood a few hundred yards from the wall, so close that the musicians could see the guard towers from the building. There he recorded the album's critics group as his Berlin period. And one song from those sessions, called Heroes, tells of 2 lovers kissing by the wall. An image Bowie later said came from a real couple he watched from the studio window. Hold that song. It has 2 more appearances to make in this story, and the second one is the reason for the flowers on Hauptstrasse. The 2 cities even learned to do business across the wound. West Germany quietly paid East Germany hard currency to release political prisoners to the West. More than 30,000 people ransomed over the years, according to the government records published after unification. Pensioners could visit across the wall, then Westerners with day permits. Families rebuilt fragile threads through checkpoints and care packages. Coffee and chocolate moving east. Letters moving both ways. Every word written in the knowledge that someone else would read it first. The wound stayed open, but the 2 halves never stopped feeling each other, the way you feel a missing limb. By the mid-1980s, the state on the eastern side was aging badly. Its economy was falling behind, its buildings crumbling, its young people restless, and its great patron, the Soviet Union, was exhausted, economically and morally. Moscow's new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, was gambling on openness and restructuring to save the system, and every East German who watched Western television, which was nearly all of them, could see that something somewhere was loosening. In June 1987, West Berlin threw a giant concert series in front of the Reichstag, with the stage set close to the wall. On the other side, East German youths gathered by the thousands just to hear. And on the worst night, the police moved in with batons, while the crowd chanted the name of Gorbachev, at their own police, in the heart of East Berlin. Among the performers on the Western stage that week was David Bowie, singing Heroes toward the wall he had written it beside, and he later described hearing, in the pauses, the crowd singing along from the other side, out of sight, in the dark. He called it one of the most emotional performances of his life. Days later, on June 12th, 1987, President Ronald Reagan stood on a platform in almost the same spot, the gate and the wall at his back, bulletproof glass between him and the East, and spoke directly over the barrier. The State Department had reportedly tried more than once to soften the speech's central line, fearing it would embarrass Gorbachev, and Reagan, by the account of his own speechwriters, insisted it stay. "Mr. Gorbachev," he said, "tear down this wall." The crowd roared. East German state media dismissed it. Most commentators, even in the West, filed it under theatre. The wall had stood for 26 years. It was the most permanent-looking object in Europe. It had 29 months left, and it would not be brought down by a president, a general, or a treaty. It would be brought down by ordinary East Germans with candles, and finished off by one man's fumbled press conference. That night, one of the strangest and most joyful nights of the 20th century, is our next chapter. Chapter 13. The Night of November 9. Great walls do not fall when they are attacked. They fall when the people holding them up stop believing. In 1989, that belief collapsed in East Germany in a matter of months, and it collapsed for reasons the wall itself could do nothing about. The first crack opened far from Berlin. In May 1989, reforming Hungary began dismantling the fortified fence on its border with Austria, and East Germans, who could travel to Hungary as fellow socialist tourists, noticed immediately. That summer, thousands of them drove their little Trabants south on vacation and simply never came home, slipping into Austria through the gaps, or camping by the thousands in the gardens of the West German embassies in Budapest and Prague, refusing to leave until they were let out. The images ran nightly on West German television, which most East Germans watched, and every image pulled more people south. The hemorrhage of 1961 had resumed. This time it flowed around the wall instead of over it. The second crack opened inside the country. In Leipzig, Monday evening prayers for peace at the Nikolai Church had grown into weekly demonstrations, and through September and October 1989 they swelled from hundreds into tens of thousands, marching with candles and one devastating chant, Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, on October 9th, with 70,000 in the streets of Leipzig, and the security forces massed, and hospitals reportedly told to prepare beds and blood. The country held its breath for a repeat of what had happened in Beijing 4 months earlier. The order to shoot never came. The accounts of that night point to local officials and commanders who, in the decisive hours, declined to give it. Once it was clear the state would not kill, the state was finished, and everyone in East Germany understood it at roughly the same moment. Gorbachev himself, visiting East Berlin for the state's 40th anniversary on October 7th, had already delivered the message that mattered, warning his hosts, in a phrase his spokesman handed to the press, that life punishes those who come too late. The Soviet tanks that had crushed the East Berlin workers' uprising in 1953 and Budapest in 1956 and Prague in 1968 were staying in their barracks this time. Within weeks, the aging leadership was pushed aside. The party scrambled to save itself with concessions, and the biggest concession of all was drafted in early November, a new travel regulation, letting citizens apply to leave the country. What happened next is so improbable that if a screenwriter invented it, you would send the script back. On the evening of November 9th, 1989, a Politburo member named Günter Schabowski held a live televised press conference. He had been handed the new travel regulation shortly before going on air, had missed the meeting that discussed it, and had not read it carefully. Near the end of a long, dull hour, an Italian journalist asked about travel. Schabowski shuffled his papers, read out that citizens could apply for private trips abroad without the old preconditions, and visibly hesitated. Reporters called out the question that changed the world. When does it take effect? Schabowski scanned the page in front of the cameras, found something, and answered, in the wording preserved on the full recording and analysed ever since by historians such as Hans Hermann Hertel, that as far as he knew, it was effective immediately, without delay. The regulation actually envisioned orderly applications starting the next day, through proper channels, with passports and visas. Almost nobody heard that part. West German television led its evening news with the sentence, "The wall is open," which at that moment was not yet true. And then East Berliners, watching West German television in their living rooms as they did every night, put on their coats and went to make it true. By late evening, thousands stood at the crossing points, calm, stubborn, growing by the minute, chanting, "Open the gate," while the border guards, who had received no orders at all, telephoned superiors who did not answer or would not decide. At the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, the senior officer on duty that night was a lieutenant colonel named Harold Jaeger, a loyal borderman of 25 years, watching the crowd in front of his checkpoint grow toward 20,000. With a few dozen armed men behind him and a telephone that produced nothing but evasions, his account, given many times since and cross-checked against the records, describes the moment his superiors dismissed his warnings one final time. Sometime around 11:30, facing a choice between shooting into his own people and opening the border, Jaeger gave the order himself. "Open everything." The barrier rose, and the crowd poured through, weeping, laughing, shouting, into the arms of West Berliners already arriving with champagne. Within hours, every crossing in the city had given way. Strangers danced on top of the wall itself at the Brandenburg Gate, where no crossing even existed, under the floodlights of the death strip, while border guards stood by, some stone-faced, some smiling, a few in tears. People attacked the concrete with hammers and chisels, and the chips became relics overnight. Grown men stood in line at West Berlin banks to collect the 100 marks of welcome money the West had long promised any visiting East German, and then walked the bright streets, holding bananas and newspapers like trophies. And note the date one last time, November 9th. The Republic proclaimed in 1918, the synagogues burning in 1938, the wall opening in 1989. Germans cannot make November 9th their national holiday, precisely because of 1938, and so the calendar itself carries the whole argument of this story. History does not often rhyme that exactly. Here, it did. What followed was almost as astonishing as the night itself, because history offers few examples of an empire's edge dissolving with so little blood. Within weeks, the East German state was in free fall. In January 1990, citizens stormed the Stasi headquarters in Berlin, and, this matters, they saved the files rather than burning them, choosing memory over revenge in the very building that had weaponized memory against them. In March 1990, East Germans voted in their first free election since 1932 and chose rapid unification. The wartime allies and the two Germanys negotiated through the summer, and Gorbachev consented to a united Germany inside NATO, a concession that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. On October 3rd, 1990, less than 11 months after Schabowski's fumbled sentence, the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist, and hundreds of thousands gathered at the Brandenburg Gate, under the quadriga, as the black, red, and gold flag rose over a single Berlin. Think of everything that Copper Goddess had seen from her chariot, stolen by Napoleon, rearmed by Schinkel, saluted by torchlight parades she could not refuse, caged for 28 years in the death strip, facing west, going nowhere. Now she looked down on fireworks and one reunited people. The following summer, the Parliament of Unified Germany voted, by a margin of just 18 votes, to move the capital back from Bonn to Berlin. The swamp town had one more act to perform, and in some ways it was the hardest one of all. It had to figure out how to live with everything it remembered. That final act, and the city you would find there this morning, is our last chapter. Chapter 14. The City That Remembers. Every chapter of this story has begun somewhere in the past. This one begins with a decision about the past. because that decision is what makes modern Berlin unlike any other city on earth. In the 1990s, reunited, Berlin faced a question no city had ever faced at this scale. What do you do with the physical remains of two dictatorships? A genocide administered from your own office buildings, and a wall soaked in the memory of a divided people. Most cities in history have answered such questions the same way. Demolish, rename, move on. Paris paved over its revolutions and planted gardens on them. Boston turned its founding traumas into a walking trail. Berlin, after long and bitter public argument, chose the opposite path, and it chose it deliberately, in parliamentary votes, in juried competitions, in decades of debate carried out in full public view. It decided to keep the evidence. Walk the city today and you see the results everywhere. And they are not like ordinary monuments. In 2005, after a debate that had run for some 17 years, Germany opened the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, designed by the American architect Peter Eisenman, 1 block south of the Brandenburg Gate, on some of the most valuable land in the country. 2,711 concrete slabs on undulating ground. A grey field you walk into, and somewhere around the middle the city sounds fade and the slabs rise over your head, and you understand it with your body before your mind catches up. Not at the edge of town, at the centre, beside the Parliament, permanently in the way. That placement is the statement. Even more radical is the smallest memorial, because it does not wait for you to visit. It finds you at your own front door, beginning in the 1990s. The artist Gunter Demnig began setting small brass plates, each one hand engraved, into the sidewalk in front of the last freely chosen home of individual victims of the Nazis. Each plate begins with the same 2 words, Hier wohnte, here lived. Then a name, a birth year, a deportation date, a place, and, where it is known, a fate. They are called Stolperstein, stumbling stones, and there are now more than 100,000 of them across Europe, thousands upon thousands in Berlin alone, each one researched and documented before it is laid, many of them sponsored by the people who live in the building today. You do not visit them. You live above them. You pass one on the way to buy bread, and a name looks up at you from your own doorstep. From the exact threshold the name once crossed every day. The German language has a famous long word for all of this. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to come to terms with the past. And Berlin is its world capital. The Track 17 platform in Grunwald, the villa at Wannsee, the preserved stretch of the wall system on Bernauer Strasse, with its documented dead, the empty white library under the glass in the pavement where the books burned. The city keeps its wounds open on purpose, because it concluded that closed wounds, in Germany, had a way of becoming infected. While it argued about memory, the city also had to rebuild its body. And the 1990s turned central Berlin into what journalists at the time routinely called the largest construction site in Europe, Potsdamer Platz. Once the roaring Times Square of the 20s, then a bombed wasteland, then the death strip itself, grew a whole new commercial district out of the bare Berlin sand in under a decade. The old ground taking new foundations one more time. The Reichstag, wrapped head to toe in silver fabric by the artists Christo and Jean Claude in 1995. 5 million people coming to see a parliament turned into a gift, was then rebuilt by the British architect Norman Foster with a glass dome that the public can climb. a spiral ramp rising above the debating chamber, so that citizens literally walk over the heads of their representatives and look down on them at work. Ask yourself which other nation would rebuild its legislature as a transparency metaphor, and you begin to measure what this city learned, and what the learning cost. The honest ledger includes the struggles too. Unification was harder and crueler than the fireworks had promised. Eastern industry collapsed under sudden competition. Unemployment in the eastern districts ran painfully high for years, and the resentments of that decade still shape German politics, visible in election maps that trace, with uncomfortable precision, the line of a border that officially no longer exists. Berliners even coined a phrase for the barrier that outlived the concrete: Die Mauer im Kopf, the wall in the head. The city government went effectively broke in the early 2000s, and its own mayor, Klaus Wowereit, turned defiant honesty into a global slogan when he called Berlin poor but sexy. The poverty was real. So was the sexy. Cheap rent in the emptied eastern districts did for the 90s and 2000s exactly what the draft exemption had done for the 70s. It filled the city with artists, musicians, and club kids from every continent, and the techno culture born in the abandoned power stations, bunkers, and bank vaults of the reunification years, in clubs like Tresor and later Berghain, became a Berlin export as recognizable worldwide as anything the Kings ever built. The party on top of the volcano, it turns out, is a Berlin tradition older than the volcano, and the city of refugees kept its oldest habit. Today, roughly 1 Berliner in 4 holds a foreign passport, from well over 100 countries, and the largest communities trace back to the Turkish workers who arrived in walled West Berlin in the 60s, whose grandchildren are now simply Berliners, running the corner bakeries and sitting in the city parliament. In 2015, when hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Syrian war reached Germany, and again after 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent millions west, Berlin's train stations filled with volunteers holding food, toys, and handmade signs. The scenes were imperfect, the strains real, the arguments loud, because this is Berlin, and arguments are how it breathes. But the reflex itself was unmistakable, and by now you can name its ancestors. The Edict of Potsdam, the families from Vienna, the flour sacks falling out of the sky, 3.5 centuries of the same instinct. Berlin grows by taking in the people history displaces, because Berlin has been those people. So come stand one last time where we began, at the Brandenburg Gate. This morning, the quadriga rides above you, green copper against the sky, stolen once, caged once, and now simply there, watching tourists take photographs on ground where teenagers bled to death within living memory. A double row of cobblestones runs beneath the traffic, tracing where the wall stood, and children hop along it without knowing what it marks, which is, if you think about it, the entire point of everything anyone ever did here. This city was never supposed to exist. It was a swamp with a toll bridge. It was burned by war, halved by its conquerors, rebuilt in large part by its women, fed from the sky by its former enemies, and freed, in the end, by its own people in the streets and one bureaucrat misreading a memo. It gave the world the research university and the quantum, the threepenny opera and the tuberculosis bacillus. One of the worst crimes in modern history, and the most honest reckoning with a crime that any nation has attempted. Every city remembers selectively. Berlin tried forgetting once. in the tidy silence of the 1950s and found it could not breathe, so it became something rarer. The great city that survives by remembering everything, the city that keeps its scars where it can see them, because it knows exactly what it is capable of becoming when it looks away. The sand is still down there, under all of it, soft and shifting, the way it was when two little towns faced each other across a river crossing in 1237. Everything built on that sand has fallen at least once. Everything has been rebuilt at least once. That is not a weakness. That is the deal Berlin made with history. And Berlin, of all cities, keeps its receipts. If this story stayed with you, leave a thought below and tell us which city you want to walk through next. Somewhere out there, another river is waiting, and another crossing, and another story buried in the ground. The sand remembers. We will see you in the past.